Welcome back. This is Principles of Macroeconomics, and I am Liam Malloy. We are going to begin Chapter 4 with this video. So this video is sort of an introductory video for Chapter 4, where we're going to talk about inflation first and then its relationship to the unemployment rate. And so inflation is one of these things that up until about 2022, we hadn't really experienced high inflation since the early 1980s. We'd had inflation of maybe 4 or 5% as a high in the late 90s. But mostly inflation had been really low in the sort of 2% range. And when something is low like that, we tend not to pay a lot of attention to it. And so now, after the pandemic and the experience of high inflation reached 9% in 2022, we're much more focused on it. And so we're going to talk about that in this chapter and think about our experience during the pandemic and what has changed, and do we expect it now to go back in that sort of 2 to 3% range, or should we expect higher inflation in the future? All right. So the relationship between inflation and unemployment is going to be important. And really, when we think about inflation, what we want to think about is supply and demand, right? And so this is why some macro textbooks really use that sort of aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which we have in sort of the background in our wage setting and price setting model. But really what's going on when we have a lot of inflation is that there's too much money chasing too few goods, right? So if people want to buy a lot of stuff, but we can produce a lot of stuff, then we don't expect prices to go up. It's really when we want to buy a lot of stuff, but we aren't or can't produce as much as people want to buy, that we see prices going up and we get general inflation. And so that's really the key. And we'll talk about different causes of inflation a little bit later in this chapter. But really, that's what it boils down to, right? Too much money chasing too few goods. All right, so we'll start out with an introduction. That's what this video is. Then we'll go into first a measurement of inflation, sort of how we measure inflation in general. There are actually lots of different measures of inflation. And then what's the problem with inflation, right? So why do we want only 2% inflation rather than 4 or 5% inflation? And why don't we want 0% inflation, right? That might seem like the best option. But in this case, as we'll see, a little bit of inflation is actually good because it helps sort of the general relative prices adjust, whether we're talking about wages, right, the price of labor, or the differences between, consumer goods versus consumer services, housing versus food. All of those things need to adjust. A little bit of inflation helps that happen. And then in section C, we'll talk about inflation and unemployment and introduce the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is an observation in the data that says that we have higher inflation when unemployment is low and lower inflation when unemployment is high. And we'll see that there's been historical periods where that's true and historical periods where that has broken down. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then in the last section, we'll talk about the different causes of inflation and whether they come from supply causes or demand causes, or things like an increase in the price of oil. So that's how we'll conclude. All right. So if we look at inflation, and this looks, I think, like UK inflation, we can see that, there are periods where inflation can be really high. So often in a war where there's a lot of demand for labor, for goods, prices will spike. And so we saw a spike of inflation both during and then right after World War I, that then cratered, right? And prices dropped back down. The Great Depression, we actually saw a lot of deflation. So deflation is where we have negative inflation. So prices are going down. We'll talk about the problems with that. And then we had sort of inflation in the 70s and early 80s caused, at least initially, by significant oil price increases due to the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and then some wars in the Middle East. That caused a spike in the price of oil as well. But then you can see that, after the mid 1980s, we tended to have fairly low inflation in the UK, as this graph shows, but also in the United States, until the end of the pandemic, where there was a lot of money in the system and people wanted to buy a lot of stuff. But at the same time, the pandemic was causing some supply issues, and people were shifting what they wanted to buy. And then, of course, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which increased things like oil prices some, but also especially natural gas prices, and that led to inflation as well. Now, the good news in the United States and in most of these countries is that inflation has come back down. So I said, it reached a high of about 9% in 2022. Actually, the CPI data for the United States was just released the day I'm recording this, on June 11th. And overall inflation is only about 2.5% from a year ago. And that's not too bad, right? The Fed targets 2% inflation. And so we're mostly back to where we want to be, with a few exceptions, right? Housing prices are still increasing faster than we would like. That's about 4%. Whereas other prices have actually fallen. All right, so we'll talk about how we measure consumer price inflation, why it creates winners and losers, right? So some people will benefit, some people will not. Then we will introduce the Phillips curve and the relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation. And then we will come back to our wage setting and price setting model, and look at inflation and aggregate demand and how that sort of helps explain what's going on in the Phillips curve. Okay, so we will stop there for this introductory video, and when we come back in the next video, we'll focus on measuring inflation and who benefits and who loses when we have higher inflation.